By the winter of 1476, much of Eastern Europe believed Vlad III Dracula was already finished. Some thought he was dead. Others believed he had become nothing more than a wandering relic of older wars, a brutal prince whose name had outlived his power. But rumors surrounding Vlad had always behaved strangely. Even when he disappeared, stories continued moving faster than armies. Villages whispered his name after sunset. Merchants carried tales of forests filled with impaled bodies. Priests described him as either Christianity's defender or a punishment sent by God himself. To his enemies, he was a monster. To many in Wallachia, he was the last ruler willing to terrify invaders more than invaders terrified them. And now, after years of imprisonment, betrayal, exile, and political survival, Vlad was returning once again to reclaim his throne. But this time, something felt different. The world around him had changed. The Ottoman frontier was shifting. Noble families no longer trusted old alliances. Even former supporters had learned to survive by adapting to stronger powers. Vlad understood this better than anyone, because no ruler in Eastern Europe had survived more betrayals than he had. As he rode through the cold forests of Wallachia with a reduced force of loyal followers, Vlad no longer looked like the unstoppable prince from older legends. Years of captivity and endless warfare had hardened him in different ways. He trusted fewer people, spoke less, slept lightly, and according to several surviving accounts, he had begun watching even his own allies with suspicion, because in the final years of his life, Vlad understood something terrifying. The men most likely to kill him were no longer his enemies. They were the people riding beside him. Still, he pushed forward. Villages once loyal to his family cautiously reopened their gates. Old supporters emerged from hiding. Some still kissed his hand. Others bowed while carefully avoiding eye contact. Fear had always surrounded Vlad. But now, something else surrounded him too. Exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion alone, but the exhaustion of a ruler who had spent his entire life surviving worlds that constantly changed around him. And somewhere beyond the mountains, hidden beneath snow, politics, and silence, his final hours were already approaching. Not on a battlefield of glory, not beneath triumphant banners, but in confusion, in isolation, and perhaps in betrayal. When Vlad III Dracula reclaimed the throne of Wallachia in late 1476, the victory felt strangely quiet. There were no massive celebrations, no triumphant processions through crowded streets, no certainty, only tension, because by now, nearly everyone in Wallachia understood a dangerous truth. Vlad could return to power, but the world that once feared him had already changed. The nobility no longer trusted old rulers. Merchant families had adapted to survival through compromise. Border lords secretly negotiated with stronger powers whenever necessary. Even soldiers who publicly swore loyalty often served whoever looked most likely to survive the next winter. And Vlad knew it. He saw it in the way men greeted him. Too formal, too careful, too rehearsed. Fear had once united his rule. Years earlier, nobles trembled when he entered a room. Entire villages obeyed before his riders even arrived. Stories of impalement had spread across Eastern Europe like plague itself. But fear changes over time. At first, it creates obedience. Eventually, it creates waiting. Waiting for weakness. Waiting for opportunity. Waiting for the moment the monster finally bleeds. Inside his restored court, Vlad quickly noticed something unsettling. Conversations stopped when he entered chambers. Advisors avoided direct opinions. Military commanders delayed reports. Messengers arrived late, or not at all. And everywhere he looked, he saw eyes measuring him, not admiring, not loyal, measuring. Because the ruler returning to Wallachia was no longer the terrifying young prince of earlier years. He was isolated, outnumbered, dependent on fragile alliances, and surrounded by men who had spent years learning how to survive without him. At night, Vlad reportedly slept in different rooms unpredictably. Guards changed constantly. Wine was watched carefully. Food was inspected before meals. Even inside his own residence, suspicion moved like smoke through every corridor. Some accounts suggest he began carrying weapons at nearly all times. Others claim he trusted only a tiny circle of remaining followers. But perhaps the most disturbing detail of all was how quickly he seemed to expect betrayal, because somewhere deep inside, Vlad may already have understood something history rarely admits. Men like him rarely die peacefully, and rulers feared by everyone often die alone. Meanwhile, beyond the borders of Wallachia, danger was already moving again. Ottoman forces were reorganizing. Rival claimants whispered promises to dissatisfied nobles. Informants traveled between courts carrying rumors of Vlad's weakness. And in the middle of it all stood a ruler who had spent his entire life terrifying others, now slowly realizing terror no longer guaranteed survival. The final campaign of Vlad III Dracula was supposed to restore fear. Instead, it created confusion. By the end of 1476, reports began spreading that Ottoman-supported forces were once again moving toward Wallachia. Rival claimants to the throne gathered support. Border regions shifted loyalty almost overnight. Villages that once welcomed Vlad's riders now closed their gates before sunset. And somewhere inside this growing instability, Vlad made a decision that would become his last. He chose to ride out personally. Some chroniclers later described the campaign as small and chaotic. Others barely recorded details at all. That alone has puzzled historians for centuries. Because for a man as feared and mythologized as Vlad, his final battle appears strangely unclear. No grand military account. No definitive battlefield description. No heroic last stand carefully preserved by witnesses. Only fragments. And fragments often hide uncomfortable truths. According to surviving reports, Vlad moved with a relatively limited force through rough terrain near Bucharest. Snow covered much of the countryside. Visibility was poor. Messengers struggled to travel. Information arrived late and often contradicted itself. Perfect conditions for betrayal. Some accounts claim Vlad attacked too aggressively. Others suggest he believed reinforcements would arrive and miscalculated timing. A few darker theories suggest something far worse, that men inside his own force may have deliberately abandoned him once fighting began, because the battle itself seems to collapse unnaturally fast. One moment Vlad was alive, leading cavalry through confusion and winter smoke. Then suddenly, he was gone. Some soldiers later claimed they lost sight of him during combat. Others insisted Ottoman troops surrounded him directly, and some whispered that he was not killed by enemies at all, but mistaken for one of them by his own men during the chaos. The story sounds unbelievable, until one remembers who Vlad had become by then, a ruler feared by enemies, distrusted by nobles, politically inconvenient to powerful allies, and isolated almost completely. In such situations, confusion becomes useful. especially for people who benefit from silence afterward. By nightfall, rumors spread through the surviving camps. Vlad was dead, but no one seemed fully certain how. Some described decapitation. Some described ambush. Some described total battlefield chaos so severe that even identifying bodies became difficult. And perhaps most strangely of all, no dramatic final speech survives. No witness account describing heroic last words. No carefully preserved royal farewell. For one of Europe's most infamous rulers, history records his ending almost like a disappearance, as if the man called Dracula did not die in glory, but simply vanished into snow, steel, and confusion. When news of Vlad III Dracula's death finally spread across Eastern Europe, the reaction was strangely divided. Some celebrated immediately, some refused to believe it, and others waited, because for years Vlad had stopped feeling like an ordinary ruler. Stories surrounding him had become so violent, so exaggerated, and so psychologically powerful that many people no longer separated the man from the legend. To peasants, he was sometimes protector. To merchants, executioner. To nobles, nightmare. To enemies, something worse. And now the man Europe had learned to fear was supposedly dead. But even death did not end the uncertainty around him. According to multiple accounts, Vlad's body was recovered after the battle, but not intact. Some chronicles claim his head was severed and sent to Constantinople as proof of death. Others disagree on where the body was found, who identified it, or even whether the corpse truly belonged to him at all. That confusion matters, because history usually remembers the deaths of famous rulers clearly. Vlad's ending feels strangely fragmented. Some later stories describe Ottoman officials displaying his head publicly to confirm the death of the infamous Wallachian prince. Other accounts claim surviving followers secretly recovered parts of his remains for burial. And then came the rumors. Not political rumors. Not military rumors. Something darker. People claimed Vlad's grave was empty. Monks whispered about strange disturbances near burial sites. Villagers spoke of sightings in forests after sunset. Travelers carried stories from tavern to tavern describing a prince who had died violently and therefore could never truly rest. Of course, many of these stories appeared decades later. But that is exactly what makes them important, because by then, Vlad was no longer just history. He was becoming myth. And myths grow strongest when the truth disappears. The reality was likely far simpler and far more tragic. Vlad probably died in confusion during a brutal regional conflict that larger powers barely cared to document carefully. His enemies wanted him gone. His allies needed stability more than loyalty. And Europe itself was already moving into new political realities. But ordinary people rarely preserve simple endings, especially for terrifying men. They preserve feelings, fear, shock, relief, and unfinished questions. So while other rulers vanished into archives and forgotten graves, Vlad's final hours transformed into something else entirely. A legend people kept rebuilding every generation, not because they understood him, but because they feared what men like him represented. A ruler willing to become more terrifying than the world surrounding him. And even centuries later, the world still remembers the fear. Over time, Vlad III Dracula became almost impossible to separate from the stories built around him. The impalements, the forests of bodies, the blood-soaked legends, the fear. Generation after generation, Europe transformed Vlad into something larger than history itself. Printers spread horrifying pamphlets describing impossible cruelty. Travelers exaggerated stories with every retelling. And centuries later, fiction would turn him into something almost supernatural. But hidden beneath all of that mythology was a real man whose final hours were likely far less theatrical than the legend people preferred. Because the truth about Vlad's death is not glorious. It is lonely. There was no triumphant empire protecting him. No united nobility defending his legacy. No peaceful palace waiting for his return. In the end, the feared Prince of Wallachia stood inside a collapsing political world where loyalty had become temporary and survival mattered more than memory. And perhaps that is the most important part of the story. Vlad spent much of his life using fear as a weapon because he believed ordinary mercy could not save small kingdoms trapped between stronger empires. Wallachia stood between expanding Ottoman power, Hungarian politics, shifting noble alliances, and constant instability. Rulers who appeared weak disappeared quickly. So Vlad chose something else. He chose terror, not because it made him loved, but because he believed it made enemies hesitate. For a time, it worked. But terror creates another problem. Eventually, everyone waits for the terrifying man to fall. And when he finally does, very few people remain willing to protect him. That may explain why Vlad's ending feels so fragmented in surviving history. Once he died, larger powers moved on quickly. Regional politics changed. New wars emerged. New rulers replaced old fears. But ordinary people remembered something different. Not diplomacy. Not strategy. Emotion. And fear lasts longer than political records. That is why centuries later, people still know the name Dracula even when they know almost nothing about the actual prince behind it. Because history often preserves monsters more easily than human beings. Yet perhaps the strangest truth of all is this. Vlad probably never intended to become immortal in memory. He only wanted to survive long enough to stop his world from collapsing around him. Instead, his world collapsed anyway, and history transformed him into something far darker than the man who died in the snow of Wallachia.